Good evening. My name is Amanda Melton. I'm the McCracken County Coroner, and I'm so glad to look out at this crowd and so many familiar faces. For those of you I do not know, I would love to meet you afterward. So I have a lot of content, okay? And it's because I like this job, I'm very enthusiastic about it, and there may be some parts that I run through really fast. If you want, at the end, we'll have a question and an answer, so make a note if there's something you'd like for me to talk about just a little bit more, or a question. So when Bobby approached me about this, she said she would like to talk about the day in the life of a coroner. And I kind of chuckled to myself because I think of my career as very atypical. And I say that because here's the definition of atypical. And my mother's here, so she can attest that a lot of this has described me my whole life. But behavior that is unusual or different from what is considered the norm. That's me. And my career reflects that as well. So I think of this too as a career that is constantly in the gray area. In other words, rarely can we ever say we're always going to or we're never going to. It's always a set of fluctuating circumstances. So the why. This is a question I get asked all the time. How did I find myself in this career? And again, I want to reference my mother here. So we grew up in a small town in Dresden, Tennessee. And it's one of those populations where you know almost everyone, and if you don't, you know of them or you know their cousin. So because of that, and just because we really loved that community, we went to funerals quite often. And my mother owned one of the 2 beauty shops in town, so we also went to the funeral home to do hair. And she took me with her because she didn't love that job so much, but I did. I became intrigued by it and ended up in my early 20s in mortuary school at SIU in Carbondale, and had a really long career that I loved as a funeral director embalmer at Milner Indoor Funeral Home for most of that career. I had the opportunity to run for coroner, and it was something that had always intrigued me. I knew a lot about it and felt like it was the next step for me. So in 2019, I started my career as coroner, and here I am. So I want to do this in a format of questions I get asked often. And there's rarely a time I go to dinner or run into an acquaintance that something doesn't come up about my career or some questions. So here are probably some of the most common. Am I on call all of the time? Who helps me? Do I have an office? And where is the morgue in McCracken County? So let's start with these. Okay, so if we took a 30-day month or a 31-day month, I'm on call 18 or 19 of those 24-hour shifts. That's a lot, that's true. But I do have 12 days off call, and some of those I try to really take the day off. Some of those I'm still available by phone and email and things. But I do really love it though. I am assisted by 2 deputy coroners, Jason Logston and James Scott. Wish they could have been here tonight, but they had to cover call for me. They're both wonderful people and do a fantastic job. So this guy is laughingly called my work boyfriend, and I'll have to say that it's partially true. This is Dr. Christopher Kiefer. He is the medical examiner in Western Kentucky who serves 24 counties. He's one of the most fascinating people I've ever met, ever. We have conversations that last an hour, typically because we go all around the world to discuss something. We both communicate in that way. And he is on my call list. If I have a complicated case or I have a detail I need to discuss, he's my guy. Do I have an office? Yes, in the McCracken County Courthouse. And there's proof. Now I'm in the basement and you have to look hard for me, but I am there. Okay, so if any of you all watched Ozark, that was a very, very popular series. And I did like the series, but I had not started season 4. But I knew something was going on because my phone just went crazy one night. What had happened was season 4 of Ozark dropped and all my friends were binge watching it. So unbeknownst to any of us, in episode 6, they end up in Paducah, Kentucky at the McCracken County morgue. Okay, so all of my friends start texting me saying, oh my gosh, where is the McCracken County morgue? I was like, well, that's a good question. I would love to know that myself. I've never seen that building. Never been to it, and it doesn't exist. So anyway, but it was interesting nonetheless. Okay, so when we watch all of these shows, and I know you do or you wouldn't be here tonight, let's face it, and I do too, we just call it crime and murder. I mean, that's the genre. So, but you know, the terms coroner and medical examiner, they're confusing at times, and depending on where you are, depends on what term you use. So I'm going to talk about Kentucky. So in Kentucky, the coroner is an elected constitutional office. So I ran for office, people voted for me, the score was in the newspaper, it was a little unnerving, but that's what happened. I am what they call a death investigator. That's the easiest way to explain the role of coroner. I go on the scene and investigate the death. Also, so here's an easy way to remember what the medical examiner does. The medical examiner is the post-mortem physician for the decedent. So in other words, if we had a tricky case that the cause of death was not evident and we needed much further in-depth analysis of that case, Dr. Kiefer would step in, and he has like 14 years post-grad experience. He would take over at that point. I would still assist with medical records, but he would be the primary responsibility at that point. So here's what makes McCracken County unique. And I have lived here since I was in my 20s, and I love Paducah and McCracken County so much. But we're unique in that if you think about us and our surrounding counties, they're small, they're rural. We have 2 regional hospitals, an interstate, an airport, waterways, and they estimate that our population swells by about 40,000 people every day because of the people coming into Paducah. So if you think about it, when you see an ambulance running lights and siren, they're coming into Paducah, right? People are being brought here. So that makes our caseload much higher than our surrounding counties for that reason. So common question, how many investigations do we perform each year? So this is from 2019 when I started until now. You can see, you know, we've had a slight uptick. It's always going to be probably around in here, but they do project that the death rate will continue to climb, and that is because of the baby boomer population that is aging. Yeah. So I get asked this, do you attend all deaths? Well, if I did, I would never ever go home and get to see my sweet puppy and all those things. So I don't. There's a statute that guides when the coroner performs a post-mortem investigation. It's all the things that you already know, I'm sure. It's, you know, the most tragic. It's accidents, homicides, suicides, drug-related. Those are the ones we go out on, absolutely, for sure, every time, and you know about these. Here are the ones, though, that I think you probably may not know about, and I call these the UNs, but the unexpected, unwitnessed, unexplained, unattended by a physician. So here's a scenario. A person's at home, they leave to go on an errand, they come back, their loved one has died. This was not expected. No one was there when it happened. There's no reason it should have happened. Nobody knows, has any idea what led up to that. So because it meets the UNs, that is a situation where the coroner is going to respond. And that happens a lot. Now, most of those are determined to be natural deaths, but at the time, we don't know that. We don't know what has happened. So we have to go in and conduct a death investigation at that point. We also go to all emergency department deaths. So you may wonder why. Well, it's because the initial incident happened somewhere else. And we don't know what happened off-site because we're not there. So what we do is we go into the emergency room, we start our investigation there. If any part of it does not align or seem right, then we start making calls. We'll call, whichever police jurisdiction, ask them, because they were usually there. What did you see? What do you think? We can call the ambulance, talk to them, see what their observations were. And if needed, we can start sending out detectives to secure that place, whatever we need to do, but it kind of all starts with the coroner responding to the emergency room. Believe it or not, this happens quite often, I'd say 10 times a year. Somebody drives up to the door of the emergency room, more or less pushes someone out, and leaves. So we have no history, no idea, sometimes not even any ID, and it all starts from there. And also all infant deaths, and I'm sure that's self-explanatory. Okay, does the coroner pronounce death? So if you've ever read anything, like in the newspaper, for example, they say this all the time. McCracken County Coroner Amanda Melton responded to the scene and pronounced the death. Okay, this is not entirely true. It is the common way that it's explained that the coroner was involved, but it's not entirely true because clearly everyone knows that the death has occurred. That's how I get notified. I don't really consider myself to be a first responder because the first responders are the ones who, they're in their car on shift, they go lights and siren, okay? They determine that the death has occurred and they call me. And then I respond very quickly. But so the death has already been determined before I get there. This is just one of those technicalities. Okay, so typically when we go on scene, we're trying to determine two things fairly quickly. Who is it? That is one of the main purposes of the coroner, the identification of the decedent. And you know, a lot of the time it's obvious, but there are so many times when it's not. There are people who are transients in this county. They go by a street name. Everybody knows them by Cookie, let's say, but nobody knows who they really are, where they originated. Sometimes that we have to start looking at physical identifiers so we can check, you know, the jail, see if they have anyone who fits this description. They keep records of tattoos there. We can go by things like that. So eventually we will determine who it is. And then the next big major thing is what happened. So if we start with the highest threshold, which is that a crime has been committed, and really that's responsible of us to start there. You know, we don't ever want to start down here and then have to backtrack. So we have to kind of look at it from, has something gone wrong here? And if so, that's a whole nother level of investigation that we have to enact really fast. So we start trying to determine what happened pretty quickly. So what do I do when I'm not on a death investigation? I'm the administrator of the office. So I have so many things that I do every day that involves corresponding with families. I'm going to go to this next screen because for those of you who are scientific, this is the way it computes in my brain, okay? You know how sometimes they'll say, you're the central nervous system of this operation. Well, in the coroner's office, we are truly the central nervous system of the communication when a death has occurred. So we're the ones who communicate with law enforcement, the medical examiner, insurance companies. It varies even, it can be attorneys if there's a civil suit. And this goes on and on. Even, you know, the media shows interest in some cases, we talk with them. And so daily, even the correspondence with families, maybe their death was months ago, they'll still have ongoing questions or concerns and call. So pretty much all day long, even when I'm not on call, I'm in contact with all these various people, funeral homes as well. Okay, I'm sure a lot of you have looked at a death certificate, but I find a death certificate and all kinds of documents that are officially registered with vital statistics to be incredibly interesting. And it's because they are tracking documents as well. So let's take, for example, a death certificate. It deals with specifically the person who has died, but it also has so many other questions on it. It gets down to, did the person smoke? And was smoking a factor in their death? What was the cause of death and what were considered contributors? Had the person been pregnant in the last year? their race, ethnicity, all those things come into play. So one of the reasons I tell you that Dr. Kiefer is incredibly fascinating. So in one conversation, I was talking with him about something. And he said, by the way, did you know that in 1968, the leading cause of death, and it was like a white female's age 42, and it had something to do with tooth decay. He was doing a big paper on tooth decay. And he had become fascinated with the fact that before we started adding fluoride into our water system and all of those things, there was a period in time where dental care was not taken seriously. And because of that, the bacteria in our bloodstream that would eventually affect the heart, that wasn't known at the time. And so he became fascinated with that and just spouted that out. But the reason he knew that, was able to track that, is that you can go and look at vital statistics and the death reporting agencies, and they can literally tell you how many 26-year-old white men died last year from COPD. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be able to do the investigation and research and things that we do. So you've seen birth certificates, death certificates, marriage and divorce records, adoption records. We use all of these to look at emerging trends, even product recall. We're always concerned about safety of products, and epidemics, which who would have ever thought that we would have been on the other side of a pandemic. So this is an example of a death certificate that I filled out. In those number of cases that I showed you earlier, 200 and something, 300 and something, every single one of those would be signed out by either me or one of the deputies. So I want to tell you that when I sit down and I log into the electronic death registry, and I have to put my name and my license number on a death certificate, it's still, to this day, I still think it through 2 or 3 or 4 times. And even when I press yes, it still says one more time, are you sure? And because I'm an overthinker, I sit and say, well, am I sure? Okay, is it exactly how I want it? So I ponder over these things for a long, long time. But this one was, you see where the highlighted, so it says complications of a subdural hematoma, weeks interval between the onset and death, and B is where we can say due to fall to a hard surface. So if we look down on the left side, kind of right above my name, it says fell backward from steps and hit head on a washing machine. Okay, so this is how important and detailed these death certificates are. In Part B, contributors, Lewy body dementia and Alzheimer's, manner of death, accident. So this is the kind of the end result of the death investigation after we've gotten medical records and considered all of the other facts. Another unknown of our office is that we issue cremation permits. Okay, so think about how many TV shows you've watched, and it says, we're going to hurry and go to the funeral home tomorrow and get him cremated before anybody realizes that we were involved in his death. Okay, well, this doesn't really happen in real life. So when I said I'm here to dispel myths, this is one of the reasons. Anytime this happens on the show that I'm watching, I kind of laugh because I'm like, that's just not true. I mean, it's interesting for TV, but it's not true. So I call us the interrupter in that process. So what happens is the family goes to the funeral home. They tell the funeral director that they want this person cremated. The funeral director sends a permit to the coroner's office, and the cremation cannot begin until the coroner signs it. So the reason for that is, of course, the coroner would know if there's an ongoing investigation. And if so, we would not allow that cremation to move forward. Now, we've all heard these horror stories about crematories, right? And the ones that don't handle their business correctly. This just does not happen in Kentucky. Colorado is like the wild, wild west when it comes to things like this. They are unregulated, so a lot of those examples happen there. But in Kentucky, I know for a fact, because I worked at Milner and Dorr for so many years, but we were audited all the time. Our documents had to be exactly in line with the crematory. The actual machine, is a computer. It has records on it. There has to be corresponding paperwork. There's just no way in Kentucky that it could go that sideways. So anyway, our role in that is that we issue the cremation permit and say, yes, it's now okay to move forward with cremation. So last year, we signed out 787 of those. I want to mention too that my jurisdiction is McCracken County. So even if someone died in McCracken County but they had their funeral in Livingston County, the cremation permit would still be signed out in McCracken because that's where the death occurred. Now this one right here, I thought you probably kind of groaned when you saw COVID up there, because I know we're all tired of talking about it, but it impacted my job. Many of you all impacted your job in ways that it changed you probably forever, or even the way you went forward with your life during that time. I consider it to be one of the most significant events that's ever happened to me, both good and bad, but I learned a lot from it. So commonly, there's that dreaded thing. Okay, so I found myself in situations that were just scary, for lack of another word. In the beginning, the unknown, we had no idea what the consequences of COVID were. We just didn't know. We didn't know if the information we were hearing was true, if it was embellished. All we knew is that people were getting sick. We knew people who were dying from it. At times, we didn't know how to protect ourselves. We didn't know where to get PPEs. There were so many things in the unknown. And of course, I found myself right in the very smack middle of it. These deaths that we talked about earlier that happened in the home, of course, I had to go. And you recall hearing that the emergency departments were saturated with people. Sometimes they would have to assess, the least of the sick and send them home, thinking that they had a better chance at home than in the hospital at the time. The hospital staff, the ED staff, those people, if you know anyone who worked in that environment, go to them and tell them thank you. I'm not kidding. I've never seen people work as hard, as long, under duress in my life. But anyway, so I would end up at the hospital for deaths related to COVID and in people's homes related to COVID. What would commonly happen would be that 3 or 4 people in the home all had COVID. I would mask up like I was instructed to do, and when I would walk in their home, they'd say, "You don't have to wear that in here." I was like, "Oh, no. No, I'm good. But they all had COVID, so they're thinking it's okay. But I found myself in a role almost as an educator. And if you can take the politics and the constant movement of rules and regulations and put that aside out of your mind, okay? And think of it like this. The facts we know are it made a lot of people sick, and a lot of people died from it, and some people got it and just walked right through it and had no issues whatsoever. These are still unknown things that I feel like in the future we'll get to the bottom of, but right now we still don't really know all about it. But I was there in their home in a time when people had very strong beliefs and thoughts about COVID is a joke. COVID is not happening. Yet, right there in their home was someone who was COVID positive who had died. So I ended up in these conversations quite often where I would say, okay, I don't have an agenda, and there is no pot of money out there that gets paid into the coroner's office if we call this COVID. That doesn't exist, I promise you. But here's what I do know. So the scenario would be like this. Let's say that Bob had COPD, but in general, he could live his life, and he could go to the mailbox, he ran his errands, he lived alone, he did all the things. He needed some oxygen assist at times, occasionally like a rescue inhaler, but in general, he was doing okay and living a pretty good life. But then COVID happened, and he got COVID. COVID is the thing that pushed his COPD over the threshold where his body could no longer recover. So we had these conversations constantly, and I finally came up with this language that seemed to make sense across the board. If not for COVID, do you think Bob would still be alive today? If he had not gotten COVID, do you think he would still be alive today? And they would say, yes, because he was doing fine. Like, okay, then you can see that COVID was the thing that set his underlying condition over the edge. After we had that conversation, they agreed, and it was not controversial when I would end up putting COVID on the death certificate. But then an interesting thing happened. The government started a financial assistance for people who had died from COVID. So the conversation flipped at that point. And then it was like, do you think you could put COVID on the death certificate? I'm not going to do that either, because that's fraud. But anyway, all of that to say, I think in almost any controversial topic, you can find people who are just running haywire with it. Majority of us are reasonable, and we can get somewhere right in the middle if we just have a conversation. So that's where COVID ended up for me. But anyway, we made it through, and here we are. Okay, so here's an interesting thing, and I do not want to step on anybody's toes here at all. But I do want to say that if you could put yourself in a position where a loved one of yours had had some type of tragedy or unfortunate death or accident, I think you would all expect some level of privacy, decorum, dignity while that's being handled, right? All of us agree to that. Well, so oftentimes when there's a tragic death that happens and it gets media attention and all of those things, sometimes there's not a lot of follow-up, and I'll have friends say to me, hey, why didn't we hear more details about that? What ended up happening? Well, there's several things that make me want to have this conversation with you. So I go to death sometimes in a populated area where someone is live streaming the investigation from a balcony, from an overpass, pull their car over on the side of the road. That's the over-the-top stuff. But here's the stuff, too, that I want to caution you about. Okay, so let's say you're driving down the interstate and there's a wreck on the interstate. You drive past it. You immediately go on Facebook and you post prayers for the 3-car accident on exit 16. There's a red truck, it's a Chevy, it has a Dale Earnhardt license plate. There's a blue Ford Taurus, it has a UK license plate. All these cars, so what I'm saying is you're adding in all of these descriptors. So what ends up happening is speculation. People jump on there and they'll say, oh my gosh, my daughter drives a blue Taurus, I hope it's not her. Or can you tell me more about the truck? So all of these conversations start happening. The next thing we know is people will show up on scene as we're trying to still investigate this. And it's out of concern because they're afraid that it's their loved one, but it really does cause complications. The live stream is the craziest thing to me. I have people, friends, acquaintances who said, hey, I saw you yesterday. I'm like, oh, I didn't see you. And they'd be, oh, no, it was somebody was live streaming a death investigation, and I'm pretty sure I saw you. I'm like, that's just weird to me. So anyway, I say this because just think a little bit more about posting. There are some really popular sites out there on Instagram and Facebook that almost in real live ways are posting. It's interesting, I know, because I've been guilty of looking at it, but on the other hand, I do think that, first of all, the investigators, we need a little more time before we're ready for the public to be there. We also, really try to respect the dignity of the person we're dealing with, and that becomes really hard when someone is live streaming or on the Facebook just rapidly telling what they're observing. Okay. Now, I think we should get to the fun part, or what I think of as the fun part, okay? So we were talking about, in the topics, when Bobby and I discussed this, things that are interesting and myths and folklore and all of those things. And so I put that on there because I thought this looked like Courtney a little bit. Okay. All the time people say to me, is it true that the coroner can arrest the sheriff? All right. Now I want to tell you that I do not know how to arrest anyone, but apparently, by statute, the coroner is the only one who can arrest the sheriff. Now, the great thing about this is that McCracken County historically elects really reputable sheriff. And I called Ryan Norman today and said, hey, I'm going to use you on one of my slides tonight. And he said, well, do you have handcuffs just in case I get in any trouble? And I said, actually, I do not, and I've never used handcuffs, so why don't you just stay on the good side of the law? But anyway, I think it's interesting that's a statute. Another thing is that, so I've been sworn in twice, and I've had to, place my hand on a Bible and say yes and all those things. I have to say that I've never fought in a duel with deadly weapons. I have to agree to this, that I never have. And I've not accepted a challenge to fight in a duel with deadly weapons. So that every time I feel like I'm kind of smirking when this is going on. I mean, I don't know if anybody else thinks it's funny, but I don't know why we're still talking about dueling and swords, but it's kind of funny. Okay, now this is just a total pet peeve of mine, and anybody who's ever watched TV with me, when people start talking about, we're going to go in here and look at the coffin, I'm like, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're going in to look at the casket. Here's the difference between coffins and caskets. Now, if you think about it, have any of you seen a coffin in real life? I mean, being used at a funeral. Okay, because that's the coffin on the right. I call it the Dracula, right? But that is a coffin. Now on the left, that is a casket. And in, America and a lot of other countries, we use caskets. Now coffins, I'm sure they are used somewhere, but I just don't know where that is. But they're not used anywhere around here. So now you have the correct terminology, and you can start correcting people too. Tell them Amanda said. Okay, so kick the bucket. We all have heard that. We've all said it. And I got curious about where exactly did this come from. And there are several different interpretations out there. But here's the one I think is true. Because kick the bucket is related to death. And you never hear it unless it's related to death, right? So way back when funeral homes were homes, basically. They weren't, freestanding businesses like they are now. The funeral directors, then called morticians or undertakers, would go to the home, and if embalming was going to take place, it usually took place in the home. And so because of plumbing issues and those things, they took a bucket, and the liquids were put into a bucket. And so they started saying, don't kick the bucket. Don't kick it, because if you did, you would spill it, and then we'll make a mess in this person's house. So that's how kick the bucket became synonymous with death. Okay, so wake or visitation. I don't know if any of you all have ever been to a wake, but that's not typically what happens in our region. We have visitations. Wakes are, I believe, still fairly common in the Northeast. But a wake is when the family gathers with the body And there are multiple reasons for that, but they watch over the body. It's their way of paying additional respect. There's usually a priest there, recites prayers, and they just sit there, and it's their peaceful time with that person. There's also belief that it wards off evil as long as the family's there. Anyway, visitations are what we do here, though. That's when you go to the funeral home, and it's fairly informal. Yeah, so this addresses that. It's informal where it's a come and go kind of thing. Rarely do we stop it and have prayers or recite anything during it. It's an informal situation. Okay, have you ever paid attention to the way a casket is moved into or out of a church or building? Okay, there's a specific reason why it's moved a certain way. Only ministers and priests are moved head first. So imagine if we were taking a priest into a Catholic church, the casket would be moved in face first. Okay, the theory behind that is that they would be looking at the congregation as they normally would during a service. Okay, parishioners are moved in feet first, because when we are moved in, we're looking at the pulpit. Yeah, so even in a funeral home, and believe me, this was one of the things we trained our new funeral directors on. It has to be done this way. Don't get everybody confused and do it another way. And some of our younger people, fresh out of school, they just couldn't see the significance of it. But there has to be a standard, and it needs to be done right. And this is why. So after we explained it, then they were kind of with the program. But anyway, start paying attention to that. If you ever go to the service for a priest, you'll see that it's being done opposite. Now this one's going to blow your mind, I think. This innocent little song that kids sing. But let's look at those words and consider what they mean. Okay? Now the way we sang it in Tennessee was ring around the rosies, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Okay? This one is, instead of ashes, ashes, this is the sound that you make when you're sneezing. So, did you ever wonder about that, or is that just one of those things that you just say it, you recite it, you never really think about it? So the theory on this, there are multiple people who have ideas, but in general, most people agree that this was about the bubonic plague outbreak. And those people were isolated. And so the ring was, they took roses and put them on the ground, and that kind of signified that don't go any further than this. Also because there was an associated odor, and the flowers warded off the odor. And so whether you say ashes or the sneezing sound, regardless, it's all the same. Ashes would refer to that they had died, we all fall down, and the sneezing was one of the symptoms of that as well. So now I've ruined your childhood. And I'm sorry about that. Okay. This happened to me all the time at the funeral home. We worked so hard to try to make people look as good as possible. And I really do think we did a good job. But here's what makes people not look like themselves, okay? You normally don't see people laying down. Number one, we're usually standing up. So you don't see people laying down. When a person lays down, gravity pulls their face back, just enough that it makes people look thinner or younger. That's why we have all these miraculous things that get done. Also, one last thing. Most of the time when we're all interacting amongst ourselves, our mouth is what we call slack. So we're talking, we're chewing, we're laughing, we're whatever. Rarely ever do you see somebody with their teeth clenched and their lips together. If you do, it's not sustained. It's just for a brief second. That's what makes people at the funeral home look different. In addition to the fact that they may have had an illness, later in their life right before they died. But those are the main reasons. So, give the funeral directors a break. I mean, we're trying. All right. Now, this one is going to be interactive, okay? And this is one of my very, very favorite things ever. So when I was in mortuary school, we took a class called restorative art. Restorative art is designed to help embalmers when we had a traumatic case and we needed to do some facial restoration. So it was an extensive class, was so fun, and one of the things we did was we took a clay head and we were given the task of making a celebrity with wax. And I chose Hulk Hogan. And I wish I could find the picture because it was pretty decent actually. I had to make the ear, the nose, made his beard, and then the bandana and all of those things. But in this class, we started talking about the canon of beauty and specific measurements to someone's face. And what I think you'll find interesting is when I start showing you the celebrities who have been deemed to have the most beautiful faces. They're people who just, our eye picks up these things. They really are beautiful people. But not to say people who don't have perfect proportions are not gorgeous either. That's not it. But there's something about people who have symmetrical proportions that it just draws our eye in. So the canon of beauty is just basically a fundamental rule. It's about the balance and the ratio of one's face. Actually, their entire body, but we're going to specifically talk about their face. I do want to show you this, though. You've probably seen this before. This is to demonstrate a symmetrical body. And, Da Vinci was very scientific, and if, in general, the measurements of a person's outstretched wingspan is equal to their height. So that's what he's demonstrating here. Okay, so think about your faces you look at, of your loved ones, the way they're shaped, maybe conversations you've had with your hairdresser where they advise you on what kind of hairstyle might be most flattering for you. So these are just examples of people's faces. And then we're looking at profiles. B is considered the normal profile. That is because if you took a pencil and you rested it on her chin, it would touch the end of her nose without touching her upper lip. In most of these, it would either touch her upper or her lower lip. Okay, so here we are with celebrities who are considered to have near perfect symmetry. On the left is a supermodel named Bella Hadid, and on the right is Amber Heard. Amber Heard was Johnny Depp's ex-wife, if you happen to watch that sensational trial. So these people have perfect or near perfect symmetry. And these are their male counterparts. That is Rob Pattinson from Twilight on the left and Bradley Cooper on the right. So it's called the golden ratio, and Bradley Cooper's is 91.08. I think he's pretty cute myself. This is an example of, I think we can all agree that he's pretty cute. That's Jake Gyllenhaal. But Jake Gyllenhaal does not have a symmetrical face. You see that his left eye is much bigger than his right. And his face is like one of his cheekbones is kind of shifted a little bit. But yeah, this is for all of us to say that you do not have to have the perfect golden ratio to still be very handsome, beautiful, and desirable. I think he's cute. So here's the interactive part, okay? Here's part of what we learned in restorative art, and I think you all will like this. This is a party trick, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is take your hand and put your thumb on the base of your nose, and then put it right at where the top of your nose connects with the base of your skull, okay? And keep that measurement. Okay? Okay. Keep that measurement. Then move your thumb to where you had your index finger, and your index finger should now be at your natural hairline. Notice how I say natural hairline. Okay, now keep the measurement. We're going to do one more. We're going to go from the base of your nose to your chin. Now, for most of you all, were those almost exactly the same? Okay, that is because your face is 3 noses long. Okay, so next we're going to do the width of the base of your nose. Okay, now measure your eye. That should be the same as your eye from inner to outer canthus. Okay, keep that measurement, then go to the center of your lip, to the outside of your lip. Is that exact? And do it on the other side. That's exact. Okay, all right. Okay, so if you were to measure your eye, and so then what we'll do is we'll measure your eye, and then go here, measure your eye here. You should be at your natural hairline. Go here, and you should be from the inner to the inner eye. Then this eye is the same width. Then we're going to go right back here, and this will be your natural hairline. So your face is 5 eyes wide. That's right. Now, if you'll notice, a lot of people who have really long ears will also have a really long nose. So if they were to do this measurement, their really long ear would also be a really long nose, and this part would normally be really long too. Yeah, okay. So now you can, so the reason this became important for us who did some restoration work at the funeral home was that you can take some measurements that then you can start your reconstruction, and you have the general measurement. You can look at photographs, and that's really helpful for other reasons, but the measurements are important. All right, so next time you're out, wow your friends with that. I think they'll like that. Okay, then this is the part of the last thing, but somebody told me that this headstone was in Key West, and there was nothing that would keep me from going to Key West to see it. And it really is in Key West. It is in a cemetery there, and I don't know why, but I think this is so hilarious. I told you I was sick. I really hope that I have a sense of humor as long as I'm alive, and even when it's my time to go, I hope funny stories are told about me. But in this same cemetery, there was also one that said she was a friend of Imelda Marcos on her headstone. And I thought, now, why is that so important? That would be more important than having like one of your family names or anything. But that's what it said. And then